Hi, I'm Maria from Sew Local Stitch Lounge. Today I'm going to show you how to make the Petalums head wrap from an Art Gallery knit download pattern, as well as a scrunchie. Let's go over the supplies we're using for these projects. You have 6 pieces of jersey knit fabric, 3 bigger ones and 3 smaller. The larger ones will be your head wraps and the smaller ones the scrunchies. You also have some clear elastic for the scrunchies, some thread, instructions, and a sewing machine needle that's made for stretch fabrics. You'll also need some scissors or a rotary cutter, ruler, and mat, a sewing marker, and pins. So the first thing we're going to be doing today is petting Luna. It's not in your instructions, but I think it's an important step. It makes your sewing a lot better. Okay, so that's done. And now we're gonna cut out the first head wrap. So the instructions are to cut the head wrap at 22 inches long. And I'm just gonna show you how to measure your head if you want to check and see if you want to adjust that measurement. I'm just wrapping the measuring tape around where I'm going to wear the head wrap. And I've got 22 inches and I'm going to cut my headband the same size as that because you want it to be stretched when it's on you. I'm going to be using the rotary cutter to cut my head wrap, but you can definitely use scissors if you prefer. So this is doubled. We need 2 pieces the same, 8.5 inches by 22 inches. And I'm going to line that up like that. So the first thing we're going to do is fold each length in half the long way. Line up those raw edges. And we're going to sew down that long raw edge on each one. Now I'm going to set up my sewing machine to sew with knits. I'm going to change my needle, loosen the screw, pull the needle down. So a jersey needle or a stretch needle is also called a ballpoint needle, and the tip, which you can't see the difference, but the tip is actually a little bit rounded so that it goes between the fibers of the fabric rather than trying to pierce through them. So the flat part goes to the back and you just push it up. One of the more frustrating problems when sewing with stretch fabrics is that the sewing machine will try to eat your fabric. I have a trick that stops this from happening. So you can't start sewing right at the edge of fabric. So we'll start in about 1/2 inch. Make sure that your 2 threads are pulled out behind and that you've got your hand holding them. And instead of going forward, we're going to immediately go back to the beginning of the fabric. Now I'm going to change to a stretch stitch. It will be like a lightning bolt or a SS for a stretch stitch. Now at this point you have to grab onto the 2 threads and give it a nice little tug while you go forward. So both of the seams are now stitched, and we're gonna center the seam in the middle and press the seam to the side. Now we can turn them right side out. And now you want to press it again with that seam in the center. Now we're going going to line up the two fabrics and get ready to sew the ends closed. So we're going to make them like this, and then take these two, line up the raw edges, and we're going to sew across here. And also sew these two together, right sides together. So make sure that it's the seamless sides that are touching. We're going to sew these at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, I'm going to be holding on to the beginning thread. Start by backing up first, changing to stretch stitch, and pulling on my beginning threads while I sew across. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. When you're getting close to the end of your seam, check and see if they're lining up. If they don't line up, the great thing about stretch fabric is that you can stretch it to fit. Now we have the two circles stuck together, and I'm going to press the seams open. Now we're going to sew the two short ends together, and we're going to put the right sides together like this, right at the seams, join them together. We'll open it up like this and stitch in the ditch across here. And I'm going to use a straight stitch across here. So you can see where I sewed through the center of the seam right here. And now we're going to fold it out like this. And you have a headband. So I'm going to show you what we need to make the scrunchies. You'll need a piece of fabric about 4 inches by 20 inches long, and it doesn't have to be the stretch fabric, it can be almost anything. You'll also need something to cut with, something to measure with, a big safety pin or a bodkin for pulling elastic through, marking pens, pins, and your elastic. So this is clear elastic, and it's not my preferred kind of elastic for scrunchies, but this is what we have available right now because all of the 1/4 inch and cord elastic is being used for making masks. So that's more important than scrunchies. So right now we're going to be using the clear elastic, which has a really good stretch and it's nice and tight, but it's just not quite as easy to do as the 1/4 inch elastic or the cord. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is cut the fabric to be square at 4 inches by 20 inches, around there. We're going to take this piece and fold it in half the long way. And we're going to mark 2.5 inches in from each end. And now we're going to sew from one mark to the next, back stitching at each end with a 3/8 seam allowance. Now I didn't use a stretch stitch for this piece because I don't think it's going to get a lot of stretch on it. Now we're going to turn this right side out, and I'm going to use my bodkin. You could probably do this with just without a tool as well, because it's quite wide. The next step is to sew the two short ends together. Now this is a little tricky because they're trying to fold over on themselves, so we'll just start by lining up the edge right here. And work your way down, just matching up the edges. And we're going to sew down that short seam. Now all we have to do is put the elastic in and sew up this little hole. I'm going to cut the elastic into a 12-inch piece to start with. Just keep an eye on the end of your elastic so that it doesn't get pulled all the way out. Now you're going to tie the two ends of elastic together. And this elastic is pretty slippery, so make sure it's a really, really good knot and make it tighter than you want it to end up because it's going to slip a bit. I did 2 knots, and I'm also going to tie a little knot in each end. You could trim those down, but don't cut too much off because I said it's going to slip. And we have a scrunchie. All we have to do now is sew up the hole. And you can do this by machine or by hand. I like sewing by hand, so I'm going to do it by hand. I'm going to do the ladder stitch. Just going to match up the seams first. Make sure that your seam allowance is pushed in. So I have a needle threaded, a hand sewing needle, and I'm gonna stick the needle up in the seam allowance a little bit behind my opening. And I'm gonna start by taking a stitch on the front part and then my next stitch is going to be directly above the first one. And the next one directly below that. And you just keep crossing over directly opposite of where your thread came out. And if you do this with a thread color that is an exact match, it becomes a almost invisible seam, and it's called the ladder stitch. If I stretch this apart, you can see those stitches going across like rungs of a ladder. And when you pull them, they disappear. So I'm at my last stitch. I'm gonna just make a little knot right here. Loop through 2 times. and pull it tight. And then I'm going to hide my knot by pulling that thread down like that. And then I can cut this off. And we have a scrunchie. Scrunchies are very versatile and can be worn with any length of hair.